Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video here at Libertas Institute. Today, we want to talk about facial recognition. This is an issue that a lot of people in Utah got really upset about late last year when news broke that state government had been doing facial recognition with all of our driver license photos, including the photos of minor drivers as well, 16 and 17-year-olds as well. So a lot of buzz about that. We've been working on it and wanted to bring on a couple guests today to have a great conversation about it. We have James Czerniawski, who is the Tech and Innovation Policy Analyst at Libertas Institute, and Ashkhen Kazaryan, who is the Director of Civil Liberties at Tech Freedom. Ash, let me kick it over to you first. Maybe can you give us a high-level description how facial recognition technology works? A lot of people perhaps are thinking of Minority Report, right? When Tom Cruise's character is walking through the store and he's getting all these custom offers because they scan the eyeballs of the person that he was or whatever. How does facial recognition technology actually work in a nutshell?
Well, in a nutshell, since I'm a lawyer and not a technologist, I think I can explain it in the simplest terms. Facial recognition is a method that is used to scan people's faces and identify them against a certain database that also exists in that kind of technology bubble. There are different uses for facial recognition. Main ones are for, and we're talking about government use right now, arrest identification. So when someone is arrested, their face is usually run through certain database, depending on a state or on federal level, there are different databases, which we'll go into later. A few years back, over protests of Freddie Gray's murder, police in Baltimore used actually facial recognition on peaceful protesters. So that would be also facial recognition. Then we have investigation identification. So let's say there was a crime committed and police arrives at the scene. There are some cameras. You can hear some sirens behind me to kind of give some ambiance to this conversation, I guess. But police arrives at the scene, they see some security cameras at nearby stores or buildings, and they use that footage and they run it against a certain face. Actually, a lot of problems are created here when they run it against a random face. So eyewitness would say, suspect looked like Liam Neeson or Tom Cruise, if we're talking about Minority Report. And they would literally use a photo of Tom Cruise and run it against the database or something like that. It's very tricky. It's very kind of janky. And then there's also real-time surveillance. So think of China and what they were doing during their intense COVID outbreak. They would have real-time surveillance of basically everyone in the country in major cities using cameras and using databases, seeing who's outside. Is anyone in the database as someone who has coronavirus? I think some cameras also had the technology that would identify their body temperature. So all of these different uses. And I'm sure these 4 uses that I described this is not a small or limited list, but there's so many different potentials for government abuse of power and violation of our Fourth Amendment rights as they use this.
So before we dig in more to the Fourth Amendment side, James, talk a little bit more about the tech. What is it? I mean, because as a technologist, this is really cool technology to be able, in real time to, determine all these points on someone's face, match it against this massive database, be able to come up with a person on the technology side alone. Pretty cool, and probably a lot of very useful applications in the private sector that would be very convenient for people, like in Minority Report when you're shopping, to get custom advertisements or, pull up your, oh, here, last time you came to the grocery store, you got these things. Would you like us to automatically compile a shopping cart for you based on similar items or whatever, right? Like there's cool things that can make our lives better, perhaps, with private and limited use of this technology. As a technologist, what concerns you about this, facial recognition specifically?
Well, I think as a technologist, for me personally, what concerns me most when it comes to facial recognition in particular is that it's such an early technology. It's not like it's highly advanced and really fully developed out just yet. Like we're still just trying to go and get through understanding like what we're getting wrong with it right now with uses of facial recognition technology even in the public square, like Ash was talking about, when they're using it for investigations, or like London goes and has facial recognition technology being used in their streets. There's a lot of issues that can come up with that. So there's a fair question to be asked about how you're utilizing this technology and what it should be getting used for. There's a huge difference between using real-time surveillance with facial recognition technology versus using like facial recognition technology to go and unlock my phone, let's say, which is a very rudimentary form of how you can use the technology. So there's a lot of promising things that we can look forward to, but there's definitely some legitimate concerns that people should have that would make you want to just press pause on using it in this more broad sense.
So follow-up question for you, James. Mark Zuckerberg, I think, was the one who said, and it's certainly the ethos of a lot of in Silicon Valley and Elon Musk and others, move fast and break things. In other words, let's not spend forever developing this software to get it to be perfect. Let's ship version 1, and we'll find out in the real world in real time what the kinks are, and we'll just iterate and patch those bugs and fix those issues so that we can get the crowd testing our software and real-time feedback on it, rather than waiting forever to fix the bugs and, you know, launching in 5 years. So that ethos of just let's ship the product right now. Yeah, there may be issues, we'll do it along the way. So with that ethos as the backdrop with this facial recognition technology, you yourself said that we're in kind of the early stages of this technology. Why not let the technology get out there and go through that kind of iterative process? You point out that it's very early. Should we be, as we'll get into in a moment, many are proposing that we just shut down facial recognition altogether. Why not launch early and just kind of stumble our way through facial recognition problems as they emerge?
Well, I think that, again, going back to the point that I made in the original answer, is that there's a huge difference between private use of the technology versus the public use of the technology, right? So I'm perfectly okay with the ethos of Silicon Valley to say, let's release version 1.0 of facial recognition technology and continue to, you know, modify it as we discover kinks in the software. That's not a pervasive use of the technology. It's not something that's going to really have an immensely negative effect on a consumer, so to say. But when you're talking about public use of facial recognition technology, considering how rudimentary it is, when they're wrong, it's very costly to the end user, because they're going to get accused of something that they might not have done. And this just happened not that long ago in Michigan, where law enforcement used facial recognition technology to go and arrest a minority person based off of facial recognition technology. And he was not even responsible for the crime. And it really begs the question of, again, how are we using it? For what purposes? If we're talking about, you know, using facial recognition to curtail our experience on the internet, that's one kind of thing, or even just in our everyday lives, that's one thing. But using it in this other capacity to identify criminals and whatever is not as good. And I do think that while there are calls from certain people to want to go and put like a moratorium on researching the technology, I think that that'd be wrong, because there's things that this technology could do when it develops and matures that could be very helpful. So for example, facial recognition technology is probably going to play a big role in enhancing what's called computer vision technology. This is going to be incorporated into fully autonomous vehicles. So if they can go and identify what's on the road, perhaps they can go and, you know, avoid some of these moral and ethical dilemmas that people bring up about, well, what happens if there's a child in the road or something, right? So there are some warranted reasons why we want to go and continue to develop the technology.
Ash, you mentioned the Fourth Amendment earlier, and James is kind of hinting at some of these issues as they emerge in the public square when the government is using this technology. So describe, maybe as a refresher for our audience, what the Fourth Amendment's all about, and then how does the facial recognition technology, in your view, kind of implicate or undermine those Fourth Amendment protections?
What's the Fourth Amendment all about? Fourth Amendment is all about having government, when they try to limit your rights, do that in a fashion that has some checks and balances on it. You know, if we put away the legalese, that's what it's about. It's about kind of due process. We also have the 14th Amendment. There are different combinations of different amendments to the Constitution that come into play. Actually, the First Amendment also often comes into play when we talk about facial recognition and kind of, you know, all of the faces of ourselves that we put online, but that's a whole separate conversation. I would say that they're basically a Fourth Amendment problem every time you turn a corner on facial recognition technology use. And one of the really crazy ones that I think also kind of interact with the Fifth Amendment is often prosecution does not have to disclose that they came to find the suspect in a case with using facial recognition. And we've seen, I don't remember the exact study, but I can link it later, that when prosecution was forced to do that, 90% of the prosecutions were dropped, 90%.
Wow.
So things like that are just, like fixes that should be on federal and state level everywhere, I believe. The other thing is, when we talk about facial recognition and our due process rights in general and our privacy rights, right? It's the question of this technology, I think we kind of started talking about it, is not accurate. There are multiple studies. One of the more quote unquote fun ones is ACLU did a run of faces of members of Congress, and 28 of them pinged as if they were quote unquote criminals or someone who was.
Aren't they actually criminals? Wasn't that an accurate?
As someone who is still on a work visa, I'll let you say that. But there have been multiple extensive studies that show that people of color and women have a lower accuracy when it comes to running faces against the database and using facial recognition technology. And obviously, when you have a group that's already limited in their rights just by the way the system has been structured, right? Like a criminal justice system is very far from perfect. It's often broken. And then you add this layer of technology that puts people into the system, just like James said, in that case in Michigan, there's so many cases. And often what happens to people when they are put in jail, even for 36 hours, or when they don't have access to a defender, or they don't have access to money to get out on a bail, that system breaks them. So it's definitely, facial recognition technology is not fully to blame for it, but it kind of plays a very crucial part in chain of events that can lead to Americans' rights being violated.
When I think about the Fourth Amendment, one of the things that I am most a fan of is the particularity requirement. So what that means in the context of the Fourth Amendment is that if you remember your American history, the founding fathers were very upset at what were called writs of assistance, where the British redcoats could basically sign their own piece of paper and say, aha, I now have permission to go in your home and search all the homes on this street. And there was no judicial oversight, and these were broad searches where they could just search the whole home and try and find any contraband or anything that they wanted to. So the Fourth Amendment, once written in the Bill of Rights, required not only a warrant and probable cause, but particularly describing, the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized. And so what that means is specificity is required, right? You can't just say, oh, we think Connor committed a crime, so we want to search everyone within a 2-mile radius. Well, but they're not suspected of the crime. I am. So they have to be particular to me, my house, my car, my phone, my effects. And as I think about facial recognition, one of the clashes with that is that they end up doing these massively broad searches of people. So here in Utah, as we led in with this story, talking about the Georgetown report last fall that kind of raised the flag or sounded the alarm that Utah was among a few states that they were able to identify that were not only doing facial recognition, but that were sharing with the federal government for purposes of like immigration enforcement and saying, hey, we found these illegal immigrants, so here using facial recognition, we're going to point you in their direction and kick them out. And it was very alarming to a lot of people for a couple of reasons. The main one is that in Utah, no one really knew this was happening at all. We found out, we discovered, here's, a privacy watchdog organization. We had no clue that this technology was being used, let alone the fact that it had been used for a decade. They had been using this software for a decade and no one really knew. And in response, the government came like, well, oh, at the time we talked to, the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, and we had some conversations. I'm like, yeah, but those guys are long gone. There was no bill. There was no vote. There was no public discussion. You had some quiet backroom discussions and started using this facial recognition technology. But the second reason why people were upset, and it speaks exactly to this Fourth Amendment issue, I think, is that they were searching all of our driver license photos. These were mass searches. We discovered or learned from the folks in the government who were doing this, that what happens is that multiple times a day, they're running these facial recognition searches. They get a photo of a suspect, and then they go to the database of all of our driver license photos and scan the whole thing, scan the whole thing. So every day, people's biometric information, their faces, are being scanned or searched. They're being searched in a way multiple times a day. Even kids, as I mentioned, these 15-year-old kids with the permits, the 16, 17-year-old, they're being searched as well. No parental consent, no awareness at all. And so this mass search is being conducted. They have this kind of fishing expedition opportunity. Now, Ash, you pointed out earlier something I think that was correct, is that, sometimes the facial recognition might make a little more sense, at least in my view, when the photo is being matched against past criminal records, because these are people with a criminal record. So here's all the mug shots, right? We can go through the known criminals. That, in our estimation at least, is a little bit more reasonable, because these are people who have already kind of broken the law. That is a true government record for the purpose of enforcing crime. But when people go to the DMV and they apply for a driver's license, they have no knowledge that their photo is going to be used way over here in criminal enforcement with facial recognition. The two kind of use cases are very disconnected. And that, I feel, from conversations with lawmakers and the public, is why there was such a concern, is that it played up this kind of broad search issue. James, the question for you, though, following up on this, is what's the big deal? They're just scanning our faces. Is it that, like you mentioned the issue in Detroit, maybe you kind of get into the experience that gentleman had a little bit more if you want, but for the average person in Utah or anywhere else, a big deal. The government is trying to find criminals. So what if they use facial recognition? Doesn't that help them catch bad guys? How do you respond?
Well, again, and I think you kind of touched on it a little bit in your response there, where it's like, if you're talking about looking at photos of already existing criminals, that's one kind of thing. But these people are completely, they're completely innocent. They haven't necessarily done anything. And if you're presumed innocent, you should be able to retain that right from not having something unreasonably done to you. I don't think most people realize when you go to apply to a license, because the state views it as a privilege, that you're giving up a lot of things that you might not necessarily think about when you go to apply for a driver's license until after the fact, and you find out about these stories. And that's a very interesting problem to have, where when it comes to government use of these technologies, we don't necessarily find out about the abuse and malpractice until long after the fact. So when it comes to just saying that it's just a face, it's just whatever, it's not just a face, it's not just a person. These are actual people with lives, and like I said, the cost when this happens is immense to the person that's been wronged, right? So like I said, for people that have been wronged by government use of technology, for example, there was a guy in Arizona who had a geofence warrant issued on him, and it completely derailed his life. He got held in jail for 7 days, and he was put out in a press release and everything. Right? The cost is just so immense that we have to be extraordinarily careful when we're using it. Otherwise, again, you're impacting somebody's life in such a drastic way.
Ash, I want to ask you kind of about the congressional response. There's lots of chatter in Congress. I believe a bill was recently filed. As you have your kind of finger on the pulse of this issue, what are you seeing from potential national response that states like Utah and law enforcement in particular who's using this, or just the average, concerned citizen, what should we be looking to in terms of potential movement on the federal level?
Obviously, the conversation has changed since we've had Black Lives Matter protests, and we as a country are, having very tough and needed conversations on race and racial justice. I think that gave definitely new energy and willingness for a lot of members of Congress to look into issues and to look into questions that affect minorities the most. And facial recognition was one of them. We have seen Senator Markey introduced, I believe, Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act of 2020, suggesting that we put a moratorium, which means we put a pause on use of facial recognition by government, I believe for a year or two. I might be wrong on how long. There are a couple of bills like that, and they all have different, amount of time they would apply for. But basically the idea is, let's put a pause on how we're using this technology until we pass legislation that can put the right checks and balances into place. What's interesting is that while Congress is still discussing this and this hasn't moved as much, we have seen private initiative. We have seen big companies that are known for selling face recognition technology. IBM, I believe Amazon, have come out and said, we are not gonna, so we're putting a moratorium on ourselves. Like for a year, we're not gonna sell government this technology or this database or this algorithm, combination of both. So definitely there is a lot of willingness in DC right now to have this conversation. What I am worried about is that it's gonna get kind of pushed aside because an election is coming up and basically everything is going to get pushed aside that's not relevant to a presidential election. We are only 3 months out. And B, obviously, urgency very fast, unfortunately, can just kind of dissolve. Right now, we are finally, again, having these important conversations. Are we going to be in the same place in January of 2021? No one knows. No one could have definitely predicted 2020 as the year it has been for all of us. So I think it is very important to have these conversations and to get this right, and to focus first, absolutely, on government use of facial recognition.
James, as we're wrapping up, I want to give you an opportunity to mention our Privacy Protection Act and how it might be able to respond to issues like this. So walk our viewers through a little bit of what that proposal entails, and then specifically to facial recognition and the concerns that many people have here in Utah about that use. How would a proposal like that be relevant?
Yeah, of course. So the Privacy Protection Act was something that we developed here at Libertas in response to the events that unveiled in Utah surrounding a company called Banjo that had a sole source contract with the state of Utah to go and tap into all of its state surveillance infrastructure. This was done on the basis of, well, they can go and help law enforcement respond to anomalies, they called it, faster. Now, the interesting twist to that story is that the founder had a KKK past, and since that time he's resigned. But when this revelation happened, a lot of people were shocked by the fact that the state had a contract with a person that was utilizing these kinds of technologies, and there could be racial bias and these other kinds of concerns. So we proposed this Privacy Protection Act because these technologies are getting utilized by government without any kind of public buy-in, without any kind of discussion with the public whatsoever. And we felt that it was important that as we're looking at trying to figure out how these technologies are going to develop, how they can be used, it was important, in our opinion, to go and figure out a way of establishing some guardrails so that way there wasn't use and abuse of technology like we see so much with this kind of issue here. So the Privacy Protection Act basically outlays a couple of key things. Firstly, it goes and it creates a committee that would go, it would first create a privacy officer in the state of Utah. This would be different than the one that is currently housed in the Department of Technology at Utah. His express purpose would be to go and look at these civil liberties aspects of technologies that could be concerning. So like I said, looking at racial biases and other kinds of potential security concerns that citizens might have over uses of different kinds of technologies. And then it would also then go and look at a committee who would go and look at this technology and look at the different kinds of questions that could be raised as a result of the use of this kind of technology, and then offer up recommendations for whether or not or how these kinds of technologies could be used by the government. So right now, with the way that theoretically facial recognition technology is at today, if we were to put it through here, somebody would file a complaint with the privacy officer in Utah about the facial recognition technology use in Utah, and he would review this complaint and see if there's any merits to it. And if he felt that there were, he'd kick it over to this committee who would review this technology further. This committee would be consisting of experts from all across the spectrum in technology, from people that have backgrounds in coding to ACLU type people that deal with civil liberty issues to lawyer types that have to deal with privacy concerns. So it's a very robust group. And again, they would go and they would evaluate facial recognition technology in this case, and then come back with a determination of if it's going to be allowed, if it's not going to be allowed. If it is, what kinds of guardrails can we put in place in order to go and ensure that it's being done in the most ethical way possible.
So yeah, we'll be pushing that in the upcoming legislative session, first state to have such a proposal, and try and be a little bit more proactive in responding to some of these uses of technology. So the government can't just quietly implement an Orwellian state. They at least have to be public about it and ask Mother May I before they proceed. So we'll see how that goes. Ash, before we wrap up, maybe share a brief word about tech freedom, help our viewers understand who you are, what you do, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm going to hijack that opportunity and also talk about some reforms. But Tech Freedom is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., and we focus on tech policy issues, very broad, everything from telecom issues, broadband deployment net neutrality, to free speech online, civil liberties, encryption, facial recognition, all of those technologies that violate our Fourth Amendment and many other rights. What I wanted to say about reform, first of all, I wanted to applaud you guys for being one of the most effective and active players in this field, countrywide. And I want to wish you good luck in making sure that happens. And I think it's a very important first step. There's so many other things that we need to do as we have this facial recognition discussion, regulation, debate. Unfortunately, sometimes this debate has gone into we should fully ban it versus no, it's perfect, let's not change it ever. And neither of those are realistic. You can't put the genie back into the bottle, but the genie is extremely dangerous to a lot of people, to a lot of minorities. So we have to take a very good look and do some really serious, crucial reforms. Some of the things to consider would be limiting real-time facial recognition to only cases of emergencies. So peaceful protest wouldn't qualify. Some national security situation would, and it would be only limited, 72 hours or something like that, depending on the situation, of course. So that would be an emergency exception. Make sure that there's a judicial authorization based upon probable cause when you use facial recognition. Make sure that using facial recognition in body cameras and live feeds is that I would be okay with banning, because that creates an enormous amount of data that constantly goes into police, databases and stays there. So they're constantly, that Orwellian state often happens through body cameras. So that would be something also to focus on. Obviously, making sure that there's no sharing. So you talked about the perpetual lineup of a Georgetown study. No sharing between different branches of government unless it's very important amongst different levels of law enforcement, different agencies. These databases should not be, if you work for an agency X and you focus on, drug, if you focus on drug investigations, agency Y shouldn't have access to your database if they are focused on, immigration. Something like that shouldn't be happening. And obviously, the first one that we need to just even know what's going on is transparency and testing of the technologies that are currently used. So you need to know how accurate is the algorithm and technology, facial recognition technology that law enforcement is using. And also, how are you using it? How often do you use it? Who else has access to it? The transparency part of it is so important because we are slowly finding out from different leaks and lawsuits how broad facial recognition violations are, and we are not even aware of it.
Well, I appreciate you hijacking that, because it is important to talk specifically about some proposals. We had a bill here in Utah on facial recognition containing a number of those proposals that didn't advance because it was so late in the session, but there is a lot of interest for putting some boundaries around the use of this technology. So definitely something that is going to be a conversation moving forward. And, especially when you look at like IBM and Amazon and Microsoft outright dropping facial recognition contracts with law enforcement, refusing now, or at least pausing the deployment of those technologies to law enforcement. The government isn't innovating this technology on their own. It's these private companies who do it and then license or sell the stuff. And so free market pressure can definitely work to get these businesses to not do business with the government and provide them the technology they want. So lots of avenues for reform. Ash, appreciate you mentioning several of them because this is very important moving forward. Thanks to both of you. We've been joined by James Czerniawski here at Libertas Institute, our Tech and Innovation Policy Analyst, as well as Ashkhen Kazaryan, who is the Director of Civil Liberties at Tech Freedom. And where can people go, Ash, to learn more about your organization?
We are at techfreedom.org, and on Twitter, we're at techfreedom.
And then if you want to learn more about the Privacy Protection Act that James mentioned, you can go to libertasutah.org, where you can find that and many other proposals. Thanks to you both for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.